All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion of the film Picture a Scientist, presented by the BU Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. My name is Dr. Melisa Osborne. I'm a research assistant professor in the graduate program in Bioinformatics and a member of the Biology Anti-Racism Committee.
And my name is Barkha Shah, and I'm a lab supervisor in the Department of Biology and also a member of BAC, Biology Anti-Racism Committee. And we're very excited to be here today to discuss this important topic.
So our goal in holding this event is to respond to the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion that are raised in this film when it comes to women and women of color in STEM. We hope that this panel can serve as a starting point for discussions at BU and beyond, and that these discussions can lead to action and change in scientific culture at the institutional level.
Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded, and it will be held in two parts. First, we will pose a question to the panelists and allow time for individual responses and group discussion. Then, for the second part of this session, the panelists will address audience questions. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box at the bottom of your Zoom window, and I'll do my best to bring them up during the presentation. We will also have some time for questions at the end.
All right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our wonderful panelists to you. So we have a PhD graduate student in CAS biology, Marisol Dothard. We have Dr. Cale Hartman, a lecturer in CAS biology. We have clinical associate professor of mathematics education, Dr. Alejandra Salinas. Dr. Obi Anochi, City Lab Education Coordinator and a BU alumna. And anchoring our panel, we have Dr. Felicity Crawford, a clinical associate professor of special education from BU Wheelock. Thank you all so much for joining us today, panelists. We're thrilled to have you here. So we're going to start off the discussion just by briefly asking you to tell us a little bit about your own reactions to the film. Specifically, if there was a moment that really resonated you on a personal level. And so we'll start off with Dr. Anochi. Obi.
Hi. Well, I will say that there are certain aspects of the film that did touch me in a way that in a sense that I recognize some of the things that the women were saying, but I was also extremely disturbed too when I saw some aspects of it, especially when it came to Jane, the oceanographer, and her experiences as a graduate student, because while I've definitely experienced harassment and been in situations because I was a woman, but also because I was a Black woman, it never crossed that line of being like demeaning and derogatory in such a sense and physically abusive. But the other aspects of, being left off emails, being told to my face that I was like stupid and, wouldn't be able to understand anything and I should stop or I shouldn't go down the path I was going, those all unfortunately resonated a little bit too realistically, if I will say. And it also made me kind of sad because you think, I don't know if all women, but obviously most women experience some sort of this issue. And it's sad because my sister, one of my younger sisters is a junior at BU, and she wants to work at NASA someday. And I'm concerned because of all the things I experienced going through getting my master's degree and my PhD. I don't want my baby sisters to have to go through that as well. And I'm hoping that having more discussions like this and meeting other women and all of us like banding together, because nothing will change if individual people stand up in individual groups. It has to be a collective whole, right? All of us have to stand up and say like, this is enough. We have to be better. And I know things have improved. Obviously, in the film, they spoke to one of the women from MIT, that corralled 15 other tenured professors, and they stood up and real changes came from that. And those were already the steps that are leading to, say, all of us being here and having a foot in this academic realm and being able to say, like, now that we're doctors and we're heading towards that direction. So I understand that changes have been made, but there's still a lot going on. And I'm just happy to be involved in a talk like this, honestly, because it means that we're heading in that direction. More people, not just women, you know, men, everyone, more people are ready to have this discussion and to lead in that direction.
Thank you so much. Kale, could you speak to your personal level of involvement with this film?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of felt similar to what Obi was saying, that I didn't have a lot of these kinds of experiences, but a lot of what they were saying did resonate with me. I think something I really thought a lot about while watching the movie was my privilege. I am really lucky to have had female mentors and been surrounded by a lot of females throughout graduate school. So it really made me think about, you know, my privilege, how unaware I was of how pervasive the situation still is. You know, I knew things like this existed in the past, but I definitely had that view like, oh, things are getting better, but things are not, they're not better. They might be getting a little bit better, but it is really important to be a part of that change, like Obi was saying as well. I think a lot of things resonated with me. One of the things that really resonated with me was that women have different expectations. We're supposed to be nicer. This comes out a lot. I've done a lot of reading about gender bias in evaluations, student evaluations of teaching. Being a lecturer, woman, it's definitely a big problem where students expect women to be nicer. I've been told that I'm not empathetic enough in my evaluations. So yeah, I think it's really important to get the word out there, and I'm really glad that we're doing this and glad that I got the chance to watch the movie.
Marisol?
Yeah, I also was very struck by how I think we all have had experiences that were exhausting, and they make you do that teeny tiny little like double take where you're like, did that really happen? Was I really subjected to that? Like, how do I move forward from that moment? And I'm maybe most disturbed by how specific and particularly disturbing all the things that happened to Jane were, and that the repercussions took forever. This is just like not really the kind of thing that you would really expect anybody to want to make up about something that happened to them. Obviously, there's a lot about survivor discussions and trying to not invalidate what happens to people. But I mean, I just can't imagine why anybody would want to make up an entire trip of absolute misery, an entire degree of absolute misery. And so it was really hard to watch the aftermath and kind of be struck by how slowly that process happened, how many times it felt like there were just slaps on the wrist before something really happened. And yeah, just definitely echoing what Kale said about the privilege. And I was just really, really impressed by how even at the top, you have so much to fear still as a woman. And I really liked in the movie how they had the aspect of the sort of younger generation post the MIT ladies that didn't even realize, you know, how much stuff the women even before them had to go through. And I think, you know, we could even be, you know, one generation behind the women in the video at this point, and trying to sort of ascertain like what's the temperature, how to move forward in the right ways. I think that's kind of what I took as the next steps. But I feel like the strongest bonds are like the people you suffer the most with. And I felt very empowered by knowing that we all have a lot that we're working towards together, and we'll most likely be able to make a difference moving together forward.
Thank you so much. Felicity, could you tell us your reaction to the film?
Sure. Nancy Hopkins, one of the 6 scientists in this documentary, identified the manner in which she collected data to illuminate the disparity in how space was allocated to male and female scientists at MIT. She worked in the dark. She worked alone. and in secrecy. That struck me. And I wondered, why is it that the victims are still the ones carrying the burden of addressing the problem of sexism while bearing the consequences of victimization? And why is this the case when the problem did not and does not originate with them? I was especially disappointed that there weren't any enlightened professors from MIT, male professors, that is, out on the lawn speaking out against sexism or injustice, or showing their support for the women at that institution and at ours, and more importantly, for women in science. You know, similarly, with the grad student, Adam Lewis, who witnessed the abuse of his colleague and did nothing, all because he did not think that she minded. She did not complain at the time. She did not even, he did not, I wondered about his ethical responsibility to speak out, to speak to the abuser or the abusee, even if she were to tell him that she did not mind, which she didn't. She just didn't say anything about it. Should he not have taken it upon himself to intervene, to show some compassion for what was happening to his fellow human being? In particular, I'm thinking about the excruciatingly painful moment when the professor blew shards of glass into her eyes. Boy, he chose to stay silent even then. Where was his humanity, I wondered. And today I'm wondering, is this response reflective of how our students today might respond when they bear witness to any kind of injustice? I certainly hope not. I have a lot more responses to this. I don't know how much time I have, but that's my initial response. It also, one more thing I'll say before I continue, it reminded me that the problem of sexism is neither new nor over. This documentary also reminded me of an article I read about a year ago in the New York Review. It was written by Gary Willis. He was a professor at Johns Hopkins. It started about 60 years ago. And he wrote an article called My Education at the Patriarchy. He wrote about his department head at the time. Mind you, this was 60 years ago, who chose not to give any fellowships to women who were accepted, who were qualified. He saw that as throwing away money that should be saved for those who would advance the profession. Willis at the time, it took him 60 years to admit that he did not speak out against what he saw, even though he knew it was wrong. Boy, I'm really glad that he spoke out 60 years later. But should women work, wherever they work, continue to wait this long for justice? And what is the role of higher education institutions to mitigate such circumstances? What is our role in educating students for responsible citizenship? And what metrics are we using for success? And are they enough to ensure that the polity that we have survives? I just wonder about those things.
Yeah, thank you so much, Felicity. I struggled a lot with the response of that guy too, and putting my head around it. But Allie, I'll send it off to you.
So a lot of what has been said resonates with me, but there was one person in particular that really resonated with me because I grew up wanting to be an astronaut, just like in the video. And I have my undergraduate degree in engineering, and I had an internship at a really prestigious company with a lot of other people. And it was my experience there that actually decided me to switch careers. I felt it wasn't the job that fit for me. And I didn't recognize it at the time, but thinking about it now, I recognize that all my peers, much of which were male that were also interns there, were being really supported and getting to do really cool things. And I was pretty ignored. Like, I was bored. Like, no one talked to me after the second day there to encourage me to do anything. I did nothing for 2 months, despite me asking to do things. And thinking about it now as more educated and having more experience, I wonder if it has to do with my gender, with the fact that I'm female. And speaking back to Felicity, what does the role of academia have to do this? You have to wait 60 years. It's, as we're going, like, maybe our generation is going to be better in terms of the men in STEM and science. Right? I hope so, but we're still working with people that were indoctrinated into having these biases about women, and to be allowed to be more explicit about them. And how much does that indoctrination pass on to the generation of people working and having to fit in? And I think that fighting that indoctrination is the role of education and higher education, like being explicit about fighting that indoctrination.
Definitely. Thank you so much to you and to all the panelists for sharing your initial thoughts about things. And I think this actually sets us up into actually thinking a little bit about changing those perspectives with our second question.
Just a reminder to audience, please feel free to put whatever questions you would like into the chat. Let's go on to our second question, which is, Dr. Hartman, have you taken the implicit association test that was mentioned in the film? What was your reaction to it?
Yes, I did take the implicit association test. I took it before I watched the video, actually. And I'm really glad I did that, because I really honestly had no idea what to expect. So I took it, and it turned out that I had a moderate gender bias in science, and I was astounded. I couldn't believe it. I really thought, I was like, I'm not going to have a bias. Like, I'm surrounded by a lot of females. I feel really confident that I don't associate science more with males than with females. But I ended up having a moderate bias, and I was just really surprised by that. It made me think a lot about some of my past experiences where science has been more male dominated in my life, and made me think a lot about the leaky pipeline, because, you know, even though I'm surrounded by a lot of females at my stage, I had a lot of females in my grad program. You know, the higher levels are not as female dominated, and so kind of thinking about, oh, maybe I do have a bias, thinking about why I might have the bias, and really made me think about maybe it's that leaky pipeline, that you know, those higher levels are more male dominated, and I hadn't really thought about that as much before.
Thank you so much. Speaking of the leaky pipeline, Dr. Salinas, they mentioned the leaky pipeline in the film. Can you speak to what's happening in STEM, specifically in mathematics?
So in terms of like K-12 education, the focus has been on getting girls into STEM and making girls feel like they belong in STEM. And this is done a lot through representation, like making sure that the science books have pictures of women and stories of women scientists, in addition to like the Albert Einstein type males. And I think that's sort of where it stops, right? This idea of let's get girls to go into STEM careers. And that has been relatively successful. We see a lot more girls going into STEM related majors in colleges. But according to my experiences and according to what we saw in the video, that's where we really start seeing a decline, right? So even if your original classes were 50-50 in the early parts of your STEM major, by the time you graduate, or as master's or doctoral degrees, or in your career, you see fewer and fewer and fewer. So I was thinking, what should be done? Like, what can we do to fix that in K-12 education? And I don't know, but I have a guess. I have two suggestions. And the first is that we have to be explicit with the boys that they have to be allies, that it doesn't matter, coming back to the film, if it doesn't seem like the woman is being bothered or the girl or female. I'm really struggling with this binary language, but it's for a good purpose right now. And that if they see something, say something to the aggressor, or say something to the victim about, like, how can I support you? I see this and this is not okay. So that we're building allies for the women going into the STEM fields. And the second thing I think is harder to do, I think we have to be explicit with the girls and women that want to go into the STEM field and say, yes, you should do it. And yes, you are capable. And yes, you are going to face these biases, and be honest with what they might experience, and simultaneously empower them to know how to combat them. Like find your allies, or say something if you feel safe, and if not, find someone that can say something for you. And I think that's going to be a really hard balance, so striking, like, yes, go into the field, but it might be harder for you because you're a girl. Like, I don't know the balance point for that, but that's where I think the first couple steps should be in K-12 education. And in secondary, right, in like undergraduate programs, it's like, how do we prepare science and math teachers to be able to have these conversations with their students?
Yeah. So hearing you speak about that and sort of your suggestions, I'm actually curious, Obi, you work with City Lab, and I'm wondering how you see this and encounter this, and what your strategy might be for seeing this in that environment.
Yeah, a lot of what Alejandra was saying is applied as well to science, and the push is get girls, get women interested in science. And exactly, I agree exactly with what you're saying. But then what? They go maybe do pre-med or biology undergrad, but maybe don't make it as far down the line. And that's okay. But the thing is with our program is, so we're not explicitly saying like, do this, but we're saying it is a possibility. The girls, because they are girls, they're all in high school, they asked me straight out, what are your experiences like and how is it? And granted, I don't go into the nitty gritty. I say it is quite a rewarding experience, of course, but there are times that are difficult. And exactly like Alejandra and everyone was just saying, if you do have a support system behind you, then it is possible, of course. I also, on the side, besides working with City Lab, I do work with a lot of other local organizations that specifically work with just minority and underserved communities, because especially I realized, and I'll be honest, I realized this later on in like my PhD years when people started pointing it out, right? I knew already that, yes, I graduated from the biochemistry department on the med campus. And yes, I was the only Black female for many years, the entire time I was there. I get that. And after the first year, the initial shock wore off and you continue. But then over the years, people would point that out, like, like, oh my gosh. And I was thinking, okay. But then once I would work with local students, high school students, and they were also pointing that fact out. So then it got me thinking that I see finally what we're saying. If you can see something or make you feel that you are able to do it. So this is one of the reasons after PhD life, I needed a break from doing research. That time was difficult, I'm not going to lie. And I was concerned that I needed a break from science in general because the experience was quite rough. But then I went back to what I love to do all on my spare time, which is volunteering and working with high school students and teaching science. So I transitioned to do that for my career. And I want to be someone that students can talk to if they have questions or concerns. They can reach out to me because my parents were always very supportive. They themselves have advanced degrees, so they understand what it takes to go through this situation. And my mom, she's a lawyer and she got that degree years ago. So I can only imagine what that was like. So I have parents that have always told me, like, anything you want to do, we support you and you can do it. And they also helped me navigate through the process of going through the system. Even when I was applying and getting recommendation letters, they were there, always a strong system of support. Not everyone has that. And I can't even imagine navigating this field if I didn't have a family that was with me. So I made it a mission, so to speak, and I want to be there for others, for other kids that don't have someone that's in their back corner saying, like, you can do it, or have questions about simply applying to schools and who to ask for references and things like that. They don't have anyone to talk to. That's why I like working with this age group. And to address your initial question, I'm not sure what we can do down the line, but I do know that if the more women that students can see making it further and further along, the more encouragement we give, the more honest we are. Because I spoke to a lot of women in the beginning about their experiences, and I'm not going to run away if you tell me how hard it is. It's just kind of, I can prepare myself and steel myself for it. But I would always get the same response. No, it's okay, you'll be fine. Years on the line, no, it's not okay, I won't be fine. And even when I reached out sometimes to another female advisor within the department to say, you know, this person has been saying something like this and he is in a position of power, and I don't think that's actually appropriate for him to make comments about us grabbing drinks and whatnot. And she was just like, oh, well, can you ignore it? I mean, you see, when you have female students come to you and say something like that, that already is another issue we can talk about another time. But to go back to your initial question, the more representation we have and the more we do, I mean, I don't know. That's just the bottom line. I'm not 100% sure the one thing that'll work, but yeah, everything works. Anything we do.
Marisol, I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to what Obi was saying and about, because you're probably in the earliest part of your career of anyone in our panel. And so in terms of thinking about this leaky pipeline, what's it look like from, I guess, the ground now, and what kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Right. Well, most of us are freaking pissed. So I think like this generation of people who is only just now kind of walking into being able to process things that have happened to you. I think it's fortunately way trendier to be into resistance and you know, safety pins and that kind of thing. It's cool to be resistant now. It was way less trendy several years ago, so you can't really blame anybody in some ways. But I think a huge part of why people really struggle with this pipeline is because up until this point, people were really under the impression that academia is this like noble space that's supposed to educate everyone and give equality to people. And that's not true. That is not the original intention of academia. The original intention of academia was to create community for white men to basically, you know, kind of feed egos. And it was extremely exclusionary, right? So when we're kind of adding ourselves in, right? Like we're trying to wear pants that were not tailored for us, right? So ultimately, we're always going to be pushing against the edges of this system that was not in any way built for us, right? So it's really challenging when you are just, you know, in it for the love of the game, basically. Like you're in it because you're fascinated, because, you know, you really want to make a difference. But ultimately, like the goals of academia are it's big business, like big academia, right? It's out for money. So I think the first thing that like our generation of scientists really like recognizes and clings to is the fact that like academia does not have this noble purpose that I think we sort of shoulder because we, you know, think that learning is noble and is important. It's not that. It's just a business. That's why, you know, where most of us are here, right? Like we get grants. The university wants us to get grants. Universities want money. It's profit, right? So when you really think about it that way, there is no real reason for the machinery to change in any way until you have people like us that are like, oh, actually, if you think that, you know, we are worth it, then you have to make those changes. So I think our generation really thinks a lot about how to make it really seem marketable, because ultimately what it comes down to is money, right? And when you realize how much money you're turning away by just letting women go because of your, like Kayla was saying, because of implicit biases, we have an impression that we are gaining money because we're letting these women go. And in actuality, we're probably losing millions of money, like millions of dollars, like millions of creative ideas, because we are under the impression that we are not, you know, fostering the right kind of people. And so I think part of the leaky pipeline for me is challenging when people are like, oh, people are dropping out, is that in the movie, when Jane was like, oh, like my daughter said I want to go into science, and I cried, and I'm like, okay, but please produce this profession that is not overrun and overrepresented by white men at the top. Like, you know, feel free to be upset about it, but like, it's every single institution that's based on money, right? So like, I have a really hard time kind of addressing. I mean, I think the first question to really address that is, where do they go? That's the question, because if we are only kind of thinking about the numbers and the losing portion, then I feel like we're not really able to get the experience of those people, and if they're even happier somewhere else, right? Because like, I feel like we're not the only field that has a leaky pipeline. So if everybody's leaking out, where's everybody going? So I think that's a really good place to start, and like figuring out how to move forward from there is probably step number one.
Thank you so much, Dot. Dr. Crawford, given the film and everyone's thought on the leaky pipeline, how do you think we can work towards actual change in STEM going forward? And this is a question that we're going to actually pose to each of the panelists, but Felicity, we'll have you go first.
First, let me just say, Marisol and Obi, I resonate with your emotional, with the emotional toll that this is taking. It really, your thoughts and ideas really underscore for me the importance of paying attention to both our institutional responses as well as individual responsibility. Power confirms privilege, sometimes in the absence of responsibility. Your comments on this documentary points out how powerful individual actors can shape in some instances and reshape in others our institutional response. Let's, for example, compare the response of the head of the department at BU here to the student when she came back from Antarctica, and the president's response. Upon returning to the university, the victim was told by the department to simply complete her degree and move on, right? And then the president, on the other hand, by his decision, changed the course of the university's response, and some might argue likely saved the institution from greater fallout from external folks. But I wondered, what if there were clear policies in place in the first place about field placements? Could either have been spared the responsibility of making such weighty and potentially consequential decisions? Was there any independent reporting structure, for example, in place at the time that was fair to the student? And what if in planning the trip in the first place, I know it might have been expensive what I'm about to propose, but the university could have given each student, let's say, a satellite phone to be used in moments of crisis to connect with some reporting structure at the institution. I think these are just questions that I raise as a possibility. What is really important here is, what measures should a university take to protect students from abuse, and similarly protect professors from abuse? I think this is a question I pondered throughout, and how might institutions do that, and do so in a way that ensures that all are treated fairly. When I thinking back to the issue that I mentioned initially, the graduate students' response, what is our responsibility to graduate ethically conscious students who can see and respond to overt injustices? When I think about the institutional response, I stopped and I thought for a moment, boy, this professor had a lot of power. For example, NSF, National Science Foundation, how was he able to facilitate who got grants and in what quantity? How did NSF facilitate such power imbalances? How was it that one scholar was able to decide whose research was funded in a particular region or not? While it is true that NSF did a lot of soul search and published the changes that they made as a result, are those changes enough? I wonder. And this documentary really does raise the importance of paying attention to both the individual and institutional responses. For every institution to function well, people on one hand must see it as their responsibility to maintain atmospheres in which morality extends to all and not merely a few, where civility and decency can crowd out intimidation and harassment and humiliation. It is exhausting. And when we think about the many ways in which people lose their democratic benefits, we ought to be worried about the ways in which higher education continues to instantiate inequality. It points out really too the importance of individual actors in shaping and reshaping institutions. So we are not solely working solely at the behest of the institution. Sometimes it takes us some tremendous courage to step out and to do something about it. And sometimes it means that we have to find affinity groups to begin to think about how we step out to do something. I also wondered about the ways in which institutions incentivize those who bring funding to the institution and then disincentivize those who do not. On what basis do people feel empowered to act and or not? What messages should constituents within the university take from the powerful actors within any institution? Today, I'm encouraged by BU's stance. I, in particular, was really glad yesterday when I saw what the president wrote in terms of response to the current environment and the current crises. I'm hopeful, but I think much of that will come with a great deal of work and why it is that we have to focus our attention on the issues at hand. Those of us who live in a democracy, we all do, we do not always appreciate the basis upon which such a system rests. All of the rights that we deserve as people are conferred on us, yes, but they should be equally matched by specific individual responsibilities. And that's the hard part that most of us do not yet see. So it'll be a hard road. I encourage us to continue to think about how we make the changes for ourselves, how to build resilience in order to stay with it. I'm really gratified to see and hear you speak about ways in which you want to resist. But I think we need to do so and think about the level of emotional toll that it continues to take on those who decide to step up. It is a tremendous toll, and I don't take that lightly. And I hope that others will see that that is the same. The same is true for any other kind of disabling environment.
Thank you so much, Felicity. Obi, do you have a response? How do you think we can work towards actual change in STEM going forward?
I don't know, that was a hard act to follow, Dr. Crawford. You made several amazing points, but I mean, I agree with what you said. I mean, it really does boil down to the individual. There's only so much a person and all of us can say unless people want to change and they want to be better and they do some soul searching and they say as a whole, like we need to be better and we can. I mean, there is only so much we can do. And it sounds depressing, of course, but it doesn't have to be that depressing. I mean, things like this, the fact that you've organized this panel and we're having open, frank discussions, I mean, that is the start to everything, right? A lot of things that were hidden before in the darkness obviously are starting to come out. I mean, I didn't even quite know until seeing this film about the situation with David Marchand. I'd heard rumors, but I didn't know the specifics behind it. And then of course I had to read a little bit more because I was just curious about it. But the more open, frank discussions we can have, and the more people listen to each other. I know it's difficult hearing something from someone else's perspective or hearing what they're saying. Not everyone's going to agree on things. That's just how life is. But the more we are able to talk frankly without becoming annoyed or agitated or feeling like, offended about something, the sooner we can at least get to a space where all of us are understanding each other. I think that's already the first step, because I'll be honest, like some people, you can't have as frank a conversation like this. And if you can't talk about it, how can we improve on anything? So I agree with Dr. Crawford, which is saying individually, everyone has to work on themselves. Now, how you get someone to that stage in life, I don't know, but at least, I have 3 younger sisters, not to keep going back to my family, but I do talk to them about these things. I mean, we're all at the adult stage now. They're Black women, also coincidentally happen to go into science as well, doing different things. But we've talked about like things that they'll endure or things that have occurred to them. And at least I've surrounded myself with a group of friends too, and they have as well, that are talking about it, men and women, especially the men. I mean, we've harped up on this, but it's true. I mean, a lot of the situations we're in is because it's the men that have put us in this situation. So it would be helpful and necessary if this current generation and beyond is willing to realize like, okay, I've been at fault at this, or I've perpetuated this. I do need to make some changes. And if we can at least start talking, like Marisol mentioned, and her generation, they're willing, at least more open to talk about like, how have I continued this cycle and how do I need to correct that? And I think the more men we have in this conversation, not that it's only to men, but I'm saying when it comes to more of the physical and sexual misconduct, the more men we can have in that conversation, the better. I will also say, unfortunately, throughout the years, some of the worst situations I've been have involved other women in a very odd way. I sought out in the grad school life, mentors that were women. I just was thinking, maybe this will be a great thing, women unite and all that stuff. But in 2 of the worst situations that I encountered, it was because of the older white women. And that generally throughout my life, throughout my academic life, the white women have actually given me the most issues. And I am saddened by that, because we at least have to stick together as women. I mean, this is not going to work out if we as a community can't at least come together to come consensus and say like, we have a target that we're trying to work on, like together we have to be united. And I think just having frank discussions and just opening, so many people are unaware about these things, either they haven't heard or experienced it themselves, so they're unaware. But now that we're talking about it more, I think we're heading in the right direction. It's going to be a slow change, but it is getting better. It is getting better. It is. And it'll continue getting better the more we refuse to stay silent about things and the more we talk about it and bring these issues to light. I would prefer if a student is experiencing something now, I don't care how many times and how many people you have to say it to someone versus, I'm not victim blaming or anything, but if nothing occurs or you don't say anything for years, there are other women in the span of that time that are also being affected. Because what do we know about abusers? They don't just do it to one person and stop. It's a cycle. So the more that can come to light about these situations, the better it is for everyone involved, and the better that you'll help out like the next group of women coming along. So I'm heartened about the fact that at least we can discuss about it, and we'll see where it goes. But I definitely don't have a current solution, but I think we're in the right direction, heading in the right direction.
Thank you so much, Obi. Kale, we're going to pass it to you. How do you think we can work towards actionable change in STEM going forward?
I think Obi talked so wonderfully about the first steps that we can take. Just be more open and talk about this and get it out there, let people know what the problem is. I think going beyond that, what we can do after that, or once people start realizing this and really want to make the change, we can start making some concrete systemic changes. So I know that actually a few faculty women a couple of them from BU actually, recently wrote a paper about things that we can do to make changes to support academic mothers in COVID, but also beyond COVID. And there were some really wonderful concrete ideas there to support academic mothers, things like relief of teaching, relief of service duties for these mothers. And these are things that we can do to help them have more time for their research and be productive in research, which will help them get tenure at the same time as men usually get tenure, try to help that pay gap between men and women. So yeah, I think just trying to figure out what those systemic changes can be will be really helpful. Thinking about these policies don't necessarily need to be the same for men and women. They should help women in these circumstances. So I think that's kind of taking just a different step than what Obi was saying, but I think Obi really did a wonderful job of talking about that first step that we need.
Thanks so much. Allie, do you want to add on to that?
Sure. First, I want to echo a little bit of what Dr. Crawford said. This idea that those that are the ones being marginalized are the ones that are at the forefront of the effort of constantly combating their marginalization. It's exhausting. And I mean, I'm white presenting and I'm exhausted. I can't imagine being a person of color in that same situation. So first I want to thank TJ, who is a man who organized all of this and then gave women the voice to talk. So I want to shout out for that, because I do think that we need more of that, right? We need more support of people that aren't the ones being marginalized, that do some of the work, a lot of the work, but give the people that are marginalized, in this case, the women, the voice at the same time. And I think, I mean, this is my field, so all I think about is, I think one of the ways to do that is through education, right? We need to educate people on how to help, on how to help, on how to be helpers at whatever age range they have to be. So I don't have much more to say on that because everything's been said so well, but I think education goes a long way, and education at every age level, right? There's no reason that we can't talk about how to be a helper and how to be an ally, you know, for 5-year-olds.
MDOT, the question goes to you. How do you think we can work towards actionable change in STEM going forward? Also, from your experience as a graduate student, what's one part of your experience of the leaky pipeline that you would want to absolutely change or can change?
I think something that is very interesting, that as scientists, people who sort of habitually put pressure on organisms to evolve and only the most fit survive, I find it interesting that they would try to weed people out, because obviously then are not the ones who are left the strongest of the few, and thus the mightiest, and thus the ones that will stand over and over and over again. I find that fascinating, that you wouldn't even, as people who, you know, preach Darwin in our sleep, like, you know, if we stayed, it's because we are the ones. And I think it's so frustrating to feel like we have so much work left to do, and that so much of it is in all these vague directions. But I really feel like the point of science away from academia being a huge profit institution, which is again why we're here. Very important to remember. This is why this is important. Like, everything is driven by money, and then we're just people trying to be people. Is that, you know, ultimately it's community. We're trying to build community, and when people feel that community is threatened, they want to protect it. What they don't realize is that, you know, again, we're the ones who are left. We're the ones who are here to stay, and we're not just gonna lay down and be by ourselves. We already have sought each other, right? We've already sought out small communities of women. We've already sought out larger communities of women. And I think at this point, it's more about bridging the gap, and that's what creates the allyship. Like, we have these really strong, talented, tough women who in this sense have so much in common with these, you know, people on the other side of our fence saying, oh, like, you're not smart enough, you're not tough enough. When we find those little tiny bridges that are those people that are like, you know, white dudes that basically help us, you know, it's those little bridges that really get us to where we're supposed to be. I had a very sexist, racist PI when I was at UPenn. It was very, very challenging for me. And one thing that would continually happen is I would try to explain my results and my PI would not believe them. And then I eventually had to use a strategy. Again, pressure, adaptation. I did what I had to do, right? But I eventually realized that if I got my tall, blonde, white friend named Lewis to come say the results for me, it would be no problem. And I was like, okay, so Lou can say things for me. I can still make things happen. And in the next generation, Lou sat in this meeting, watched all of this happen, and has no doubt in his mind that this is real. So he's going to be one of those people that's going to bridge the gap. So I feel like our communities now need to work harder to bridge gaps and make people see us not as just signs and not as just emails to come to diversity panels, but as humans that deserve attention and nourishment and support. I think that's a really organic next step, because once we have the community, it's not like we're trying to kick people out, right? We want people who are smart, intelligent people who, again, will make us money, right? Sad people don't make money. That's the secret. So once we realize that if we can really create that community together, move forward, we all win.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to call attention to a couple of things in the chat. TJ posted the link for us to the resources Kale was telling us about. So Dr. Davies, Fulweiler, and Rivera have a manuscript out that has some of those actionable suggestions in it. So that's in the chat. And then we also had a chat from Dr. Berkowitz, who was on the scene at MIT as a student around the same time of the faculty sort of banding together in biology at that time. And she makes a really great point about people getting drummed out. It kind of is along the lines of what she's explaining to her male friend. So the grad student is explaining to her male friend, like, well, you don't say anything, because if you say anything, you lose your place at the table. And that's sort of, it's kind of like the intersection, right, of the two things in the leaky pipeline, both the stress and the fact that if you say something to try to get rid of the stress, you're less likely to, in the end, have success. And so we only have maybe about 5 minutes left. And so one thing that I've noticed came up is this idea of how we get from the individual to the institution. Marisol, you were talking about, you know, building bridges. But I was wondering if maybe we could think a little bit more about that as a group, and if anyone had sort of any additional thoughts about how we get from. Debbie also mentioned, can we redefine what success is in our field to make it more inclusive? So I got weeded out, but grew back. I love that. Yes. And that reminds me of Veranda Montgomery's plant metaphors. But anyway, I'll send it to the panel. Sorry.
So can I offer one response to the question about what it is we need to do? I think higher education institutions being part of the problem has to be a significant part of the solution. We really need, as Ali and others pointed out, we really need to educate students on how to dismantle systems of education, of inequity. Dismantle systems of inequity, not education. Institutions must engage in and create opportunities for students to study the patterns of outcomes that exist in policies, patterns that exist in institutional activities, and trends that exist. For example, who participates and who does not. The opportunity for such engagement with data as a first step is the only way to really adequately build a multidisciplinary mechanisms for addressing root causes of inequity. The problem didn't begin in higher education. It therefore must extend well beyond that. The fact that there's still more male scientists and than any other gender is a continual reminder that the leaky pipeline is more like an open standpipe that has been running a long time unabated. And it started much earlier. It starts with children well before they're born. They are rooted in the life circumstances of their parents and their foreparents and in the systems that have been put up in place long before their existence, so that by the time we get to them, they have minimal opportunities for achievement from the start. We have to work across disciplines. We have to reshape this reality. We must address inequity and bias wherever it exists, wherever they exist, and if we ever hope to make the changes that our children can emulate, it has to be a systemic response. So while I do talk about the importance of individual responsibility, we have to not let the systems that in which we all live off the hook.
That's a wonderful point, Felicity. And I think that's a wonderful place for us to end in thinking about how we can hold the systems accountable and work towards these things going forward. So
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you being here. We know that those who joined us today are passionate about this subject. Make sure to share this film and accompanying panel recording with others that you think should see this film. If you have any burning questions or comments, feel free to email us. We'll be running this again over the summer, so we're open to any recommendations. Thanks again for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
panelists.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Obi.
Hi, Obi.
This is
It was
good
so nice
discussion.
to meet you.
Nice to meet you guys all.
Yes, I hope we see each other
Stop
again.
recording.
I hope so.
Recording it.
Oh, it's still recording.
Oh. No, well.
But it